January 17, 1942. Willow Run, Michigan. The sun has barely crested the frozen horizon when the first shift bell rings across the vast emptiness of what was, until recently, farmland. The air carries the metallic bite of winter, mixed with something else, oil, rivets, the sharp scent of aluminum being cut and shaped. A German liaison officer, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller, stands at the edge of what the Americans are calling an assembly plant, though the word seems inadequate for what stretches before him. His breath clouds in the cold air as he watches men in cloth caps and women in coveralls stream through gates that seem to have no end. He has been sent here under a pre-war technical exchange program, one of the last Germans allowed to observe American industry before the inevitable rupture. In his leather briefcase, he carries detailed notes, measurements, photographs, evidence he believes will reassure Berlin that American industrial capacity, while impressive, remains within comprehensible limits. He does not yet know that everything he thinks he understands about manufacturing, about scale, about what is possible when an entire nation bends its will toward production, is about to become obsolete. The building behind him, if one can call it a building, stretches more than half a mile in a single unbroken line. Ford's Willow Run bomber plant, still under construction, will soon become the largest room under one roof anywhere on Earth. But Muller's attention is not on the structure itself. It is on the timing board near the supervisor's station, where a number is being chalked, 63 minutes. That is how long it took to complete the previous B-24 Liberator bomber. Not to begin it, not to assemble major components, but to complete it entirely, from raw materials entering one end of this vast machine to a finished four-engine heavy bomber rolling out the other. He checks his notes again, certain he has misunderstood. In Germany, the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg can produce perhaps 15 Bf-109 fighters per day at peak capacity, and that facility represents the crown jewel of German aviation manufacturing. The Americans are speaking casually about one bomber, a four-engine bomber larger and more complex than any fighter, every single hour. He does not believe it. Cannot believe it. His training, his experience, everything he knows about manufacturing tells him this is propaganda, American exaggeration designed to intimidate. And yet, he is standing here, watching it happen. For decades before this frozen January morning, European military theorists had operated under certain assumptions about industrial warfare. They had studied the Great War's lessons carefully, understood that modern conflict would be decided not merely by valor or tactical brilliance but by the capacity to produce shells, rifles, aircraft, tanks in quantities that could sustain years of attrition. Germany had prepared for this reality with characteristic thoroughness. The four-year plan, implemented in 1936, had restructured the entire German economy toward autarky and military production. Factories had been expanded, synthetic fuel plants constructed, labor forces organized with rigid efficiency. By 1939, German military production represented the most concentrated and sophisticated war manufacturing apparatus Europe had ever seen. The panzer divisions that smashed through Poland and France were not merely tactically superior, they were the products of an industrial system that had achieved what German planners considered the theoretical maximum of military production efficiency. Japan, too, had transformed its industrial base through decades of deliberate modernization. The Zaibatsu conglomerates, Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, Nakajima, had mastered the production of modern weapons systems. Japanese naval construction had produced some of the finest warships afloat, including battleships that outclassed their American counterparts in armor and armament. The Zero fighter, entering service in 1940, represented a triumph of engineering that combined range, maneuverability, and firepower in ways Western designers had thought impossible to reconcile. These were not backward nations struggling to achieve industrialization. These were sophisticated modern economies that had successfully made the transition from agricultural societies to industrial powers capable of projecting military force across entire continents and oceans. And then there was America. Vast, wealthy, but fundamentally unserious about military matters, or so the assessment went in Berlin and Tokyo. American industrial capacity was undeniable, certainly. The statistics were impressive in a raw sense. More steel production than Germany and Japan combined, automobile manufacturing that exceeded all of Europe's output, electrical generation capacity beyond ready calculation. But this production served a consumer economy, a nation of farmers and shopkeepers grown fat on continental abundance. The American military in 1939 ranked 18th in the world in size, behind Romania. Its tank force consisted primarily of obsolete light tanks that would be slaughtered by German or Japanese armor. American fighters lagged years behind European designs. The United States Army had conducted division-level maneuvers in 1940 using trucks with signs reading "tank" because actual tanks were not available in sufficient numbers for training. This was the America that Germany and Japan assessed, rich, certainly, but soft, undisciplined, lacking the martial spirit and organizational rigor necessary for modern warfare. German officers had studied at length what they called the American character, individualistic, resistant to authority, pampered by abundance into weakness. How could such a nation, which had required 2 years to fully mobilize even during the Great War, which had retreated into isolation and refused even basic military preparation during the 1930s, possibly compete with societies that had spent decades preparing every aspect of national life for total war? The question seemed to answer itself. America might eventually contribute to any conflict through sheer resource availability, but it would be slow, inefficient, constrained by democratic politics and labor disputes and the soft unwillingness of its people to accept the discipline that modern war demanded. Muller had shared these assumptions. He had toured American automobile plants in 1938, been impressed by their scale but also by their evident chaos, the union disputes, the inefficiencies of constant model changes, the apparent lack of central planning or coordination. Ford's River Rouge plant could produce 8,000 cars per day, yes, but cars were not bombers. Cars did not require the precision machining, the specialized materials, the complex assembly of weapon systems and aircraft controls and hydraulics that made military production fundamentally different from civilian manufacturing. The jump from automobiles to aircraft represented not a linear progression but a quantum leap in complexity and precision. Germany had made this leap through years of careful development, through specialized training programs and dedicated military-industrial facilities. The notion that America could simply repurpose its automobile plants to military production seemed to rest on a fundamental misunderstanding of what military manufacturing actually required. And yet, here at Willow Run, he watches as a woman, which itself speaks to American desperation for labor, installs a hydraulic line in 90 seconds, her movements practiced and precise, then moves to the next airframe as the assembly conveyor advances. The conveyor itself is a marvel that seems to violate basic principles of aviation manufacturing. Aircraft are complex, individual creations, each requiring skilled craftsmen to fit and adjust components to precise tolerances. They cannot be mass-produced like automobiles. This is not opinion but technical reality, confirmed by every aviation manufacturing expert in Europe. Aircraft frames require individual fitting. Engines must be carefully mounted and aligned. Electrical systems need custom routing. The Americans appear not to have received this information, because the bombers roll past at intervals so regular one could set a watch by them. The symbolic weight of Detroit, not just Willow Run but the entire complex of manufacturing might that the city represents, will come to haunt Axis planners with the persistence of a recurring nightmare. Detroit in 1942 is not merely a city but a concentration of industrial capability without historical precedent. Within a 50-mile radius of downtown, more manufacturing capacity exists than in the entire nation of Italy. The automobile plants alone, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, Packard, Hudson, represent productive capability equal to all of German aircraft production. And these plants, designed for civilian production, are being converted to military use with a speed that seems to violate the laws of industrial physics. Chrysler's tank arsenal, built from nothing on farmland outside Detroit, goes from groundbreaking to first tank delivery in 18 months. Ford converts an entire assembly complex to aircraft engine production in 7 months. This is not slow American inefficiency. This is something else entirely, something that Axis planners have no framework to comprehend because it has never existed before in human history. What the German soldiers expected to find in American capacity, and what they actually discovered, represents one of the great psychological shocks of the war. The expectation was clear: America would be rich, certainly, abundant in raw materials and food, but fundamentally civilian in character. Its military production would be hampered by the same democratic chaos that afflicted its politics: labor strikes, competing bureaucracies, the unwillingness of capitalists to subordinate profit to national interest without constant government coercion. German military intelligence reports from 1940 and 1941 consistently projected that American military production would reach meaningful levels sometime in 1943 at the earliest, and even then would be constrained by shortages of skilled labor, machine tools, and the specialized alloys required for modern weapons. The reality was so different that captured German officers, interrogated about American production after 1943, were sometimes suspected of spreading disinformation because their accounts seemed deliberately exaggerated. They reported seeing tank production lines where finished Sherman tanks rolled off at the rate of one every 20 minutes. They described aircraft plants where the monthly production exceeded the entire annual output of comparable German facilities. They spoke of shipyards that could build a Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel, in 42 days, or in extraordinary cases, in less than a week when speed-building records were being set. German naval officers, shown figures for American ship construction in 1943, a year in which American yards launched more tonnage than Japan had built in its entire naval history, simply refused to accept the numbers as physically possible. They demanded recounts, insisted the Americans must be including half-completed hulls or planned construction. They were not. The numbers were conservative if anything. The shock went beyond mere statistics. It struck at fundamental assumptions about how modern industrial societies functioned. Germany had organized its entire economy around the principle of central coordination, government ministries directing production, allocating resources, controlling labor distribution. This was considered the only rational approach to military-industrial mobilization. How could the chaotic American system, where companies still competed with each other, where labor could strike, where no central planning authority existed with anything like German powers, possibly outproduce a rationally organized economy? The question tormented German economic planners, particularly after Albert Speer took over armaments production in 1942 and began to understand just how thoroughly German assumptions about American capacity had failed. The answer lay in factors that German planning had systematically undervalued. The first was scale. American factories were simply larger than their European counterparts, built with an assumption of continental markets that had no equivalent in Europe. The River Rouge complex alone covered more ground than the center of Berlin. This scale meant that conversion to military production did not require building new factories, it required adapting existing ones that already possessed the cranes, the power supplies, the rail connections, the tool and die shops necessary for mass production. The second factor was standardization. American manufacturing had spent decades perfecting interchangeable parts and assembly line techniques for civilian goods. These techniques, which German observers had dismissed as suitable only for low-quality consumer items, proved devastatingly effective when applied to military hardware. A Sherman tank contained fewer parts than a Panther, was easier to maintain, and could be produced in a third of the time. It was not as sophisticated, certainly, but sophistication proved far less valuable than quantity when the American production advantage reached ratios of 5 or 10 to 1. The third factor was one that no amount of intelligence gathering could have fully prepared the Axis powers for: the sheer enthusiasm with which American society embraced industrial mobilization once committed. The labor strikes that German planners had counted on largely evaporated after Pearl Harbor. Union leaders pledged no strike agreements. Women entered the workforce in numbers that exceeded even Soviet levels of female industrial participation. The famous Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda but understatement. By 1943, women constituted more than a third of the aircraft industry workforce, performing precision work that German factories reserved exclusively for highly trained male workers. 16-hour shifts became common. Plants operated around the clock, 7 days a week. The Ford Willow Run plant that Muller observed in its early stages would eventually reach peak production of 432 B-24 bombers per month, more than Germany's total heavy bomber production for the entire year of 1943. The recurring symbol of American industrial might, the one that haunted captured Axis soldiers and appeared in their letters and interrogation reports with remarkable frequency, was not a weapon but a vehicle: the Jeep. Simple, utilitarian, mass-produced in quantities that seemed divorced from military necessity, the Jeep came to represent everything about American production that Axis forces had failed to anticipate. German soldiers were accustomed to mechanized units where vehicles were precious, carefully maintained, rationed according to strict necessity. A German infantry division in 1941 might have a few hundred motorized vehicles supplementing thousands of horses. American divisions dispensed with horses entirely, mechanizing logistics to a degree that seemed wasteful, unnecessary, until its advantages became clear in combat. American forces could move faster, supply themselves more reliably, maintain operational tempo in ways that horse-drawn logistics simply could not match. But it was the sheer number of Jeeps that stunned Axis soldiers most. They seemed to be everywhere, used for every purpose, driven with casual disregard for their preservation. German officers observed American forces abandoning Jeeps with minor mechanical problems rather than spending time on repairs, because replacement vehicles were so readily available. This seemed insane by German standards, where every vehicle was valuable, where mechanical breakdown meant hours of careful repair work because replacements might not come for months. Yet the American approach, wasteful as it appeared, proved devastatingly effective. The ability to maintain mobility, to replace losses instantly, to treat complex manufactured goods as if they were disposable, this represented a level of industrial abundance that changed the calculus of military operations entirely. By late 1943, captured German documents began to reflect a dawning horror at the implications of American production. Intelligence assessments spoke not of whether Germany could match American output but of whether any strategy existed that did not simply lead to inevitable defeat through material exhaustion. Albert Speer, in his conversations with Hitler, repeatedly raised the production figures. Germany might, through heroic effort, produce 40,000 aircraft in 1944. The Americans would produce 96,000. Germany might build 20,000 tanks. America would build nearly 30,000, plus tens of thousands more for its British and Soviet allies. The ratios were not improving, they were getting worse as American production continued to ramp up while German capacity, despite Speer's efficiency improvements, faced constraints of raw materials, labor shortages, and increasing Allied bombing. The Japanese confronted an even more desperate version of this same arithmetic. Japanese naval aviation had entered the war with superior equipment and superbly trained pilots. But Japan's ability to replace losses was constrained by an industrial base perhaps one-tenth the size of America's. Japanese planners had understood this disparity in principle, but had gambled that American will could be broken through dramatic early victories, forcing a negotiated peace before the full weight of American production could be brought to bear. The failure of this strategy became mathematically obvious by mid-1943. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed, losing nearly 600 aircraft and most of its remaining trained pilots. The Americans lost fewer than 100 planes. But the casualty figures, stark as they were, missed the more fundamental reality: the Americans could replace their losses in weeks, would have new pilots trained and ready in months. The Japanese could not replace their losses at all. The skilled pilots were gone, and the training infrastructure to replace them had been overwhelmed by the need for rapid expansion. The aircraft could theoretically be replaced, but increasingly, Japanese industrial production was being strangled by submarine warfare that cut off the resource imports Japan's manufacturing required. The transformation in perception, particularly among German military leadership, represented one of the war's great intellectual reversals. In 1940, German officers had viewed American industrial capacity as a factor to be considered but not feared, a weight that would slowly accumulate on the Allied side but not decisively tip the balance, particularly if Germany could achieve rapid victory in the East. By 1942, the assessment had shifted to concern. American production was ramping up faster than anticipated and would pose serious problems if the war continued into 1943 or beyond. By 1943, concern had become alarm. The scale of American production was proving far beyond earlier estimates, and no German counter-strategy seemed adequate to address the imbalance. By 1944, alarm had become despair. German forces were being simply overwhelmed by weight of material, fighting an enemy that could absorb any level of casualties, replace any losses, mount offensives simultaneously on multiple fronts with an abundance of equipment that made German logistics look impoverished by comparison. This psychological transformation is documented in thousands of letters, diary entries, and post-war interrogations. A panzer officer writes home in November 1944 about facing an American armored division. They attack with more tanks than we have in the entire sector. We destroy 10, 20, and still they come. Where do they get so many? How can they build so many? We fight with all our skill and achieve nothing, because they simply have more tanks, more fuel, more shells, more of everything. A Luftwaffe pilot's diary from the same period: we shot down 4 of their bombers today. It means nothing. Tomorrow there will be more. There are always more. We cannot win by shooting them down, because they build faster than we can destroy them. The evidence was not merely anecdotal. German intelligence conducted detailed assessments of American manufacturing capacity throughout the war, and the reports make for striking reading as analysts struggled to reconcile their observations with their preconceptions. A 1943 report on American aircraft production concluded that earlier estimates had been wrong by a factor of 3, not 30% but 300%. American plants were producing at levels German analysts had calculated to be physically impossible given the number of workers and the size of facilities observed. The report's author struggled to explain the discrepancy. American production techniques must be fundamentally different from German methods in ways that were not visible to external observation. The Americans had apparently solved problems of precision manufacturing and quality control at scale that German industry still treated as requiring individual craftsmanship and careful oversight. For the Axis powers, the lesson learned was total and devastating. German industrial production actually increased under Speer's management in 1944 even as Allied bombing intensified, but it did not matter. Producing 20,000 tanks when your opponent produces 40,000 and has the fuel to run them and the logistics to supply them merely delays inevitable defeat. Japan's final desperate measures, the kamikaze attacks that began in late 1944, represented explicit acknowledgement that conventional military operations were impossible when the material imbalance had become so extreme. Better to expend planes and pilots in single-use attacks than to face American forces in battles where Japanese forces would be simply overwhelmed by weight of numbers. The epilogue to Detroit's transformation into the arsenal of democracy played out in the years immediately following the war, when the production lines that had built bombers and tanks reverted to civilian production with a speed that was itself remarkable. Willow Run, which had produced over 8,000 B-24 bombers, was retooled for automobile production. The workers who had built instruments of war returned to building consumer goods. The industrial capacity remained, expanded now beyond pre-war levels, ready to power the extraordinary economic growth of the 1950s and 1960s. The abundance that had been weaponized for war became the foundation for a consumer society of unprecedented prosperity. But the deeper legacy was psychological and ideological. The generation of Axis soldiers and officers who had encountered American abundance, who had been fed from American rations that included meat and chocolate and coffee while their own forces went hungry, who had seen American supply dumps with more material than their entire divisions possessed, who had watched American formations attack with a profligacy of ammunition that seemed almost offensive in its wastefulness, carried home an understanding of American power that no amount of propaganda could have instilled. They understood that American wealth was not a weakness but the ultimate strategic weapon, that abundance enabled a way of war that rendered traditional military virtues of discipline and sacrifice and tactical excellence insufficient. You could not defeat an enemy that could afford to be wasteful, that treated complex manufactured goods as disposable, that could lose 1,000 tanks and simply build more. This was the truth that Oberstleutnant Müller stumbled toward on that frozen January morning in 1942, watching bombers roll off an assembly line at intervals that his training told him were impossible. He did not want to believe it. His entire professional life had been built on the assumption that German military excellence, superior training, superior tactics, superior will, could compensate for material disadvantage. He had seen it work in Poland, in France, in the early months of the Russian campaign. But standing in Willow Run, watching American industrial might translate directly into military power with a ruthlessness that no amount of German skill could counter, he began to understand that everything he thought he knew about modern warfare was about to be proven obsolete. The war would not be won by superior tactics or better trained soldiers. It would be won by the side that could build more planes, more tanks, more ships, more of everything, and that side was going to be America. The mathematics were merciless and absolute. Germany had spent decades preparing for industrial warfare, had organized its entire society toward military production, had achieved what its planners considered the theoretical maximum of economic mobilization. And none of it would matter, because on the other side of the Atlantic, a nation of farmers and shopkeepers and autoworkers had discovered that they could simply outbuild everyone else on Earth combined. Not through superior planning or greater discipline or more advanced technology, but through the brute application of continental abundance and industrial capacity that was so vast it rendered traditional military calculation meaningless. This was the lesson of Detroit, the truth that the arsenal of democracy proved through the inexorable accumulation of production numbers that climbed month after month, year after year, that in modern total war, prosperity was power, that the ability to feed your population while building weapons was more valuable than any tactical brilliance, that a society wealthy enough to grant its workers coffee breaks and weekends off could still outproduce a society that demanded total sacrifice from its citizens. American abundance was not decadence or weakness or the softness that Axis propaganda claimed. It was the foundation of a war-making capacity that, once aroused, proved utterly unstoppable. The sound that came to symbolize this reality was not the thunder of guns or the roar of aircraft engines, but something more mundane and somehow more terrible, the steady rhythmic clang of assembly line production, the sound of machines stamping out weapons faster than they could be destroyed, the mechanical heartbeat of an industrial system that could not be exhausted because it was built on resources and capacity that exceeded immediate military requirements by orders of magnitude. This was the sound that German and Japanese soldiers heard in their nightmares after the war, not the scream of incoming shells but the quiet, unstoppable rhythm of American production, building the weapons that would defeat them one bomber, one tank, one ship at a time, in quantities so vast that resistance became not a question of courage but of mathematics. And the mathematics, as Muller would report back to Berlin in cables that would be read with increasing desperation by German high command, were unforgiving. If every calculation was correct, if every intelligence estimate was accurate, if American production really was ramping up to the levels being observed, then Germany and Japan were not fighting a war they might lose. They were fighting a war they had already lost, condemned to play out the remaining years until American industrial might accumulated to the point where no amount of tactical skill or strategic brilliance could prevent total defeat. The only question was how long the arithmetic would take to resolve itself on the battlefield. The answer, as it turned out, was 3.5 more years, 3.5 years of fighting against an opponent who grew stronger every month while Axis forces grew weaker, 3.5 years of watching American industrial capacity translate into military power so overwhelming that by 1945, American and British Commonwealth forces could mount simultaneous offensives across multiple theaters while still building weapons faster than they could be deployed. The arsenal of democracy had spoken, and its voice was the sound of assembly lines running day and night, building the weapons that would break fascism on the wheel of American abundance. It was not the ending that any Axis planner had imagined when they had calculated, incorrectly, that democratic capitalism would prove too weak and chaotic to meet the challenge of total war. It was, instead, the ending that Detroit had been building toward from that January morning in 1942, one bomber at a time, proving that sometimes the greatest weapon is not courage or ideology or tactical brilliance, but simply the capacity to build more than your enemy can destroy, forever, until the arithmetic of industrial warfare renders all other factors irrelevant.